In the early hours of August 7, 1942, the vast silence of the South Pacific shattered under the unrelenting thunder of naval guns. Over the turquoise waters of the Solomon Islands, dark plumes of smoke rose into the pale dawn sky as American warships unleashed their bombardment on a remote, jungle-covered island few back home had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States was on the offensive, striking at the outer edges of Japan's newly built Pacific Empire. The tranquil lagoon, moments ago a mirror of blue serenity, now churned with fire and steel as thousands of U.S. Marines climbed down rope ladders into their landing craft. Engines roared. Waves slapped against the sides of Higgins' boats. Commanders shouted orders drowned by the relentless hammering of naval artillery. The Marines, faces blackened with grime and sweat, could feel the tremor of distant shells under their boots. Ahead of them, Guadalcanal loomed, a green hell of swamps, ridges, and towering palm forests, its thick canopy hiding both danger and destiny. For the men of the 1st Marine Division, many of whom had never seen combat before, this was more than an invasion. It was a statement to the world that America would no longer retreat. Only 8 months earlier, the Japanese Empire had seemed unstoppable. They had stormed across Asia and the Pacific, conquering Manila, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in lightning succession. Their war machine, disciplined, fearless, and fueled by a fanatical code of honor, had humiliated Western powers who once believed themselves invincible. But now, in this distant corner of the world, America was ready to test its strength against the myth of Japanese invincibility. The stakes were beyond imagination. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal would control the sea routes between the United States and Australia, the lifeline of the Allied war effort in the Pacific. To lose this island would mean losing the entire southern flank of the Pacific, and possibly the war itself. When the first waves of Marines hit the beaches near Lunga Point, they expected to face a storm of bullets and fire. Instead, they were met with an eerie silence. The enemy was nowhere to be seen. The only sounds were the crashing of surf and the distant calls of tropical birds. The Japanese defenders, caught completely off guard, had fled into the jungle, leaving behind half-finished airstrips, abandoned equipment, and cooking fires still smoldering. The Marines moved cautiously inland, rifles at the ready, uncertain whether they were walking into an ambush or a miracle. As the morning sun rose higher, they stumbled upon what would soon become one of the most famous pieces of ground in the Pacific War, a rough, open field carved out of the jungle by Japanese engineers. It was meant to be an airfield, one that would have allowed Japan's long-range bombers to threaten Allied shipping all the way to Australia. The Marines seized it without firing a shot, and within days it would bear a new name that would echo through history, Henderson Field. But victory came with a cruel twist. What the Marines did not know was that the Japanese Navy had already begun to gather its counterstrike. That very night, as American engineers worked to repair and expand the captured airfield, a fleet of Japanese cruisers and destroyers, sleek, deadly, and commanded by veteran officers of the Imperial Navy, raced down from their stronghold at Rabaul. Moving under the cover of darkness, they unleashed a torrent of destruction upon the U.S. invasion fleet. The black waters of Iron Bottom Sound lit up with explosions as shells tore through the night sky. The Battle of Savo Island would become one of the worst naval defeats in U.S. history. In less than an hour, 4 Allied cruisers were sunk and more than 1,000 sailors were dead. When dawn broke, the survivors aboard the transports looked out over a sea littered with oil, wreckage, and bodies. The shock was total. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, fearing more Japanese attacks and running dangerously low on fuel, made a fateful decision. He withdrew the carrier task forces that had been providing air cover for the Marines. Within hours, the troop transports were ordered to pull out as well, leaving the 10,000 Marines on Guadalcanal alone, cut off from the outside world. The realization struck like a hammer blow. The Marines were stranded, undersupplied, and surrounded by an island they barely understood. The food that had been unloaded was only enough for a few weeks. Ammunition was scarce. Most of their heavy equipment was still aboard ships now vanishing over the horizon. In those early days, many of the men looked out over the restless sea and felt a creeping dread settle in their stomachs, a sense that they had been abandoned on the edge of the world. "We didn't know it then," one Marine would later write. "But we were the bait. And the sharks were already circling." In the jungle beyond Henderson Field, the Japanese regrouped. The initial garrison, composed of construction workers and a few infantry units, had melted into the thick rainforest, their officers radioing frantic messages to Rabaul for reinforcements. The Japanese High Command, outraged at the audacity of the American landing, quickly devised a plan to wipe out the invaders. They viewed the U.S. presence not as a serious threat but as an insult, an annoyance to be crushed swiftly by superior Japanese spirit and discipline. Within days, the first detachments of elite troops, veterans of China and Malaya, were embarked on destroyers bound for Guadalcanal. These fast warships, running supplies and reinforcements under cover of night, would soon earn a nickname from the Americans, the Tokyo Express. Night after night they raced down the slot, the narrow channel between the islands of the Solomons, bringing fresh soldiers, ammunition, and food to the desperate Japanese forces clinging to the island's jungle interior. Each night, their arrival meant only one thing for the Marines: another attack was coming. The heat was relentless. The jungle breathed like a living thing, thick with mosquitoes and disease. Men slept in foxholes filled with water, their boots rotting from constant damp. Dysentery spread like wildfire, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the humid air. The Marines learned quickly that Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield, it was an organism that wanted to kill them. Yet amid the misery and hunger, a grim determination took hold. They built defensive lines around Henderson Field, digging deep trenches and placing artillery along the perimeter. Every shovel of dirt thrown up was an act of defiance. When the first Japanese assault came at the Tenaru River, the Marines were ready. The Battle of the Tenaru, fought in the pale moonlight of August 21st, became the first great test of wills on Guadalcanal. The Japanese commander, Colonel Ichiki Kayaneo, led more than 900 men in a fanatical banzai charge against the Marine lines. He believed, as Japanese doctrine taught, that sheer spirit and aggression would overwhelm any opponent. But as his soldiers screamed and charged across the sandbar at the mouth of the river, they met the cold, disciplined fire of Marine machine guns and mortars. For hours the jungle echoed with the rattle of automatic fire and the cries of the wounded. The Marines, holding firm behind their sandbags and barbed wire, cut the attacking force to pieces. When dawn came, the beach was littered with bodies, the first grim sign that Japan's doctrine of spiritual superiority would not prevail here. Out of Ichiki's entire force, only a handful survived. The colonel himself, dishonored by defeat, committed ritual suicide. The Americans buried hundreds of Japanese dead in mass graves, the air heavy with the stench of blood and smoke. For the Marines, the message was clear: the Japanese were brave, disciplined, and deadly, but they could be beaten. As word of the victory spread, morale rose, but food and ammunition continued to dwindle. Supplies were slow to arrive, and the men grew thin and hollow-eyed. They called their diet rice and bullets, a grim reflection of their two most precious resources. The Japanese, too, suffered terribly. Their supply lines, stretched thin by the nightly battles at sea, began to collapse. Men fought on empty stomachs, living on captured rations or whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. By September, the once proud imperial soldiers had begun to call Guadalcanal something new: Shikikan no Shima, the island of starvation. For both sides, the island became a crucible. Every ridge, river, and clearing was paid for in blood. The Americans, forced to fight on terrain that negated their technological advantage, learned to adapt. They formed small patrols to hunt through the jungle, learning to move silently and strike without warning. Their tactics evolved from conventional battle to something rawer, something that blurred the line between soldier and survivor. The Japanese, long masters of stealth and endurance, found themselves outmatched not only by American firepower but by an enemy that refused to yield. Guadalcanal was no longer just a battlefield, it was a test of endurance, of willpower, of who could outlast the other in a world that seemed to have descended into madness. By the time September drew to a close, both armies had suffered terribly. The once green island had become a scarred, smoking ruin. Yet, in the midst of all the suffering, something profound had changed. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the legend that had swept across Asia and the Pacific, was beginning to crumble. The Marines, cut off, exhausted, and starving, had stood their ground and held Henderson Field against everything the enemy could throw at them. In doing so, they had proved that America's young, inexperienced soldiers could meet Japan's finest on equal terms, and win. And so the stage was set for the long, grinding battle to come. For 6 months, the island would be drenched in rain and blood. Henderson Field would become the heart of the struggle, its mud-streaked runways symbolizing both hope and survival. The jungles would whisper of ambushes and death. The nights would burn with the fire of naval gunfire, and the haunting glow of tracer rounds arcing across the dark. And as the months wore on, the world would begin to realize that Guadalcanal was not just another island. It was the turning point of a war, the moment when the tide began to shift, when ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances proved that courage, grit, and endurance could break even the most fanatical enemy. By late August 1942, Guadalcanal had ceased to be a mere island. It had become a furnace in which the fates of nations were being forged. The lush, green canopy that had once shielded tropical birds and gentle breezes now concealed death in every shadow. From the beaches of Lunga Point to the misty ridges inland, every palm tree seemed to whisper of unseen movement, every rustling leaf a warning that the enemy was near. The U.S. Marines, cut off from regular supply lines and living in constant fear of bombardment, dug in around Henderson Field, their lifeline, their hope, and their prison. The airfield, roughly carved from coral and dirt, stood as both a symbol and a target. If it fell, the Americans would lose their foothold in the Solomons. If it stood, the Japanese advance in the Pacific would be halted for the first time. Around it, the war settled into a relentless rhythm of attack and counterattack, of nights filled with terror and days heavy with exhaustion. Each evening, as the red sun sank into the sea, the men would brace themselves for the coming storm. The Japanese Navy ruled the night, and the Marines soon came to dread the long, eerie hours after darkness fell. From the north, the low rumble of engines signaled the approach of the Tokyo Express, columns of destroyers slicing through the waves under cover of darkness, their decks packed with soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. When they reached the shores of Guadalcanal, they would unleash their deadly cargo and turn their guns toward Henderson Field. The night skies would erupt in cascades of flame as shells screamed overhead, and the jungle was ripped apart by explosions. Every bombardment seemed to shake the island to its core. Men clung to the earth, praying the next shell wouldn't find them. Trees splintered like matchsticks. The ground quaked under the relentless pounding. When morning came, the landscape was unrecognizable, blackened, smoking, and littered with craters. Yet through it all, the Marines rose from their foxholes, wiped the grime from their faces, and went back to their posts. Henderson Field still stood, and as long as it did, they would fight. It was during these endless nights that the Marines began to understand the full meaning of endurance. Sleep became a luxury. Food was a rationed miracle. Malaria gnawed at their bodies, leaving them weak and feverish. Their clothes rotted from sweat and rain, their boots turned to mud, their beards grew wild and tangled. The line between soldier and savage blurred as days stretched into weeks. Still, they clung to their mission with a grim, almost primal resolve. The airmen of the Cactus Air Force, the small, battered group of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots based at Henderson Field, became their angels of survival. Flying patched-up Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers, they rose into the humid air each morning to strike Japanese convoys, disrupt landings, and fight off enemy bombers. The airfield's runways were pitted with shell holes, its fuel stored in rusting drums, its mechanics working with bare hands and scavenged parts. Yet somehow, the Cactus Air Force kept flying. Each plane that lifted into the sky carried with it not just bombs but the hope of every man clinging to life below. September brought new blood to the island, and new horrors. The Japanese, humiliated by the disaster at Tenaru, launched a massive counterattack to retake Henderson Field. The spearhead of this assault came in mid-September, led by Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines. His orders were simple and brutal: annihilate the Americans and capture the airfield at all costs. Moving through the jungle in torrential rain, Kawaguchi's troops, numbering more than 3,000, crept toward the marine perimeter under cover of darkness. Their target was a narrow ridge on the southern edge of Henderson Field, defended by just 840 Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson. The ridge was little more than a narrow spine of earth, dotted with coconut palms and flanked by steep ravines. To hold it seemed impossible. But Edson's raiders, battle-hardened and fiercely loyal, were determined to make their stand. On the night of September 12th, the jungle came alive. The first wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the trees like ghosts, their bayonets glinting in the dim light. The attack came with the fury of a storm, waves of men charging through the darkness, shouting war cries that echoed across the ridge. The Marines opened fire, their machine guns cutting arcs of light through the night. Tracer rounds streaked through the rain like burning comets. Grenades exploded with bone-shaking concussions. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the metallic scent of blood. Time seemed to dissolve into chaos as wave after wave of attackers crashed against the Marine lines. At one point, the Japanese broke through, and hand-to-hand combat erupted among the foxholes. Men fought with rifles, knives, shovels, anything that could kill. Edson himself moved along the line, shouting orders, rallying his men, his face illuminated by the flickering light of explosions. "You've got to hold," he told them. "We can't let them take this ridge." All through the night, the battle raged. The Marines fell back, regrouped, and counterattacked. When dawn broke on September 13th, the ridge was littered with hundreds of Japanese dead. The survivors crawled back into the jungle, leaving their dreams of victory buried in the blood-soaked earth. The cost for the Americans had been high, but they had held. The defense of Bloody Ridge, as it came to be known, became a defining moment of the campaign, proof that the Americans could stand against Japan's most determined assaults and prevail. For his leadership, Edson would later receive the Medal of Honor. But for the men who fought there, the real reward was survival. They had stared into the heart of the storm and refused to break. After Bloody Ridge, Guadalcanal descended into a grinding war of attrition. Both sides poured reinforcements into the island. The U.S. Army's Americall Division and 164th Infantry arrived to relieve the exhausted Marines, bringing fresh faces to the front lines. But fresh faces didn't mean relief. It meant new souls to endure the same hell. The jungle swallowed men whole. Patrols vanished without trace. The rain never stopped. The Japanese artillery, firing from hidden positions beyond the Mechanical River, pounded Henderson Field day after day. At night, the heavens themselves seemed to ignite as naval battles erupted offshore, great flashes of light flickering over the horizon, the distant rumble of guns rolling across the island like thunder. Iron Bottom Sound earned its name one burning ship at a time. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and fear, the Americans were changing. The men who had landed in August as green recruits were now hardened veterans. They had learned to move like shadows through the jungle, to hear danger in the silence between raindrops. They learned that the enemy was not a faceless monster, but men like themselves, desperate, starving, and trapped in a nightmare of command orders that demanded death over dishonor. They discovered that courage wasn't loud or glorious, but quiet, found in the man who carried a wounded comrade through the mud, or the one who stood his post through the long, rain-soaked nights when the world seemed to have forgotten them. Guadalcanal was remaking them, stripping away everything soft and leaving behind only what could endure. By October, the Japanese were growing desperate. Their high command, unwilling to accept defeat, launched another major offensive. This time, they committed more than 20,000 men, a massive effort to crush the Americans once and for all. The fighting reached a level of savagery that defied comprehension. Artillery thundered day and night. The Cactus Air Force flew until their fuel was gone, and their pilots could barely keep their eyes open. Offshore, the Japanese Navy and the U.S. fleet clashed in a series of violent night battles that turned the waters around Guadalcanal into a Graveyard of ships. In one brutal engagement, the Battle of Cape Esperance, American cruisers ambushed a Japanese convoy under the pale light of the moon, exacting revenge for Savo Island. It was a chaotic, close-range duel fought at point-blank distance, with ships firing blindly through smoke and darkness. When it was over, the sea burned with oil and flame, and the balance of power around Guadalcanal began, at last, to tilt. For the men on the island, victory still felt far away. Supplies trickled in by daylight, brought by daring transport runs that braved Japanese air raids. The Marines called these runs Operation Shoestring, a grim joke about how thin their lifeline was. Yet every sack of rice, every crate of ammunition, every drum of fuel that reached Henderson Field was a triumph of endurance. Slowly, the Americans began to push outward from their perimeter. Patrols crossed the Fanatical, raiding Japanese positions and testing the enemy's resolve. The Marines learned the art of ambush, of silence, of striking fast and vanishing into the green. Guadalcanal was teaching them a new kind of war, one fought not by ranks and formations, but by instinct, cunning, and sheer will to survive. As the weeks dragged on, disease became a greater enemy than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, the names were whispered like curses. Men wasted away, their faces hollow, their skins sallow and trembling with fever. Doctors fought a losing battle against infection with dwindling supplies. The stench of rot hung over the camps. Flies swarmed over every meal, every wound, every corpse. Still, the Marines and soldiers pressed on, driven by something beyond orders or duty, the knowledge that if they failed, there would be no second chance. Guadalcanal was not just another island to them anymore. It was a living test, a sacred burden, and a graveyard of innocence. By November, the jungle had consumed tens of thousands of lives. The Japanese continued their nightly runs, but each one cost them dearly. Their destroyers were hunted relentlessly by American planes and submarines. Their troops on the island were starving, gaunt figures surviving on handfuls of rice and stolen coconuts. Yet even in their suffering, they fought with undiminished ferocity, hurling themselves against Marine lines in suicidal charges that left the ground slick with blood. The Americans had come to respect their enemy deeply, even as they destroyed him. The two armies, locked in a death embrace, mirrored each other's courage, and each other's tragedy. By the end of 1942, the battle had become a living legend. News of the Marine defense reached home, and the word Guadalcanal began to carry a power all its own, a symbol of defiance, of sacrifice, of the moment when America stopped retreating and began to fight forward. The men who fought there would carry its shadow for the rest of their lives. They had seen what the human spirit could endure, and what it could destroy. Guadalcanal had taken their youth, their friends, and their peace of mind, but it had also given them something unbreakable. In the crucible of fire, amid the roar of guns and the whisper of the jungle, they had found victory not in glory, but in survival.